Principles of a theory set the foundation for basic beliefs of that theory. The principles of crisis theory guide the reasoning behind the intervention that is to be used. These principles are crisis intervention is time-limited and short-term, engagement and assessment occur simultaneously and efficiently. A fundamental purpose of crisis intervention is to meet concrete and emotional needs through the provision of services. Crisis intervention must move quickly, seeking to help a client return to previous levels of functioning. The first principle is crisis intervention is time limited and short term. What this means is a crisis can occur at any time with the client's symptoms ranging in severity. Given that some crisis situations may not be predicted, a worker must act quickly to an individual circumstances within the short time frame that the crisis may occur. The second principle, engagement and assessment, occur simultaneously and efficiently. Given the short amount of time that a worker has to build rapport with a client, the information gathering and rapport building must occur very quickly. During this time, the worker is building trust while beginning to define the client's problem to move forward in the intervention process. To build this trust and rapport quickly, a worker can utilize general micro skills, including displaying warmth and genuineness to the client's circumstances. The worker relies on the use of questions as a primary intervention strategy, and the important task of assessing risk is done in the course of joining the client, defining the problems, and identifying the goals. The third principle, meet concrete and emotional needs through the provision of services. Crisis intervention provides a solution-focused approach that emphasizes the client's problem through their perspective while developing action plans that offer a sense of empowerment by helping them identify resources that they may have lost sight of. The final principle, moving quickly to help a client return to previous levels of functioning. This principle just defines the many of the steps to the crisis intervention that require a worker to act quickly and simultaneously to engage in several steps of the general intervention model at once in order to begin immediately identifying the client's current needs. Identifying these needs quickly will allow a worker to begin guiding a client on how to move forward and assist them in returning to their original state of equilibrium.
Crisis theory can be used in multiple facets of social work, whether it's in the field, out with families in crisis, or in a setting where individuals must go when a crisis occurs. Social workers are usually involved in one aspect or another. Possibly the most direct form of crisis work that social workers can be involved in would be response with emergency responders such as fire, police, um, going out into the field and seeing families as crisis has just occurred or is occurring. The individuals are often in that temporary state of psychological disorientation and are unable to function or know what their next steps are. Social workers respond with fire and with PD during these situations to help the families coordinate what their next steps could or should be and be able to be a sounding board for them in their state of need. Imagine showing up with fire as there's been a death at the home of someone's loved one. They have kids running around, they have family showing up, there's policemen and fire running through their home. Having a calm individual there, the social worker, to be able to guide them through the process is more than valuable in that situation. Most individuals that end up in a hospital setting or come there for services are in some state of crisis. Hospitals are normally not a place where you go for just a minor bump or bruise. You're either in medical crisis or one of your loved ones or close friends are in a state of crisis at the time. Social workers work in a multitude of departments in hospitals to include the emergency department, neonatal, any department that you could imagine, working with the family in case management normally, but also in those crisis situations where decisions need to be explained. There might be difficult decisions being made about relatives, arguments between family members. Social workers often act as mitigators or, and sometimes interventionalists to get the family on the same page, explain the options, and help them to come to a solution that's sound for their family. Some of the issues that social workers face in this setting are issues with insurance companies not covering, so there can be financial crises involved in this situation as well. The family needs coping strategies to get through these times, and often there's information that social workers have to include community resources, in-hospital service, as well as services for outpatient. Hospice is another facet of social work, um, where social workers work with the family and medical personnel to deal with the loss or impending loss of a loved one. Family members are usually in a state of crisis, um, and usually with hospice being involved, they know that there's a possibility of death of a loved one. So, dealing with all the emotions that come along with that, making difficult decisions, um, and having a multitude of family members around can complicate the situation. So, social workers come in and give the resources necessary, help with case management, um, and act as a guide through this difficult time. It's also important not only for the family members, but the individual facing impending death or severe illness to make sure that their autonomy is valued and respected so that they get a decision while they have the ability to make those decisions. So the social worker can act as an advocate not only for the patient but also the family members involved. Crisis intervention teams work alongside the mental health field. They have social workers on staff who assist with call outs of possible suicide, of harm to oneself or another. There are stipulations and guidelines that limit what the crisis team is able to do. Normally, it involves assisting the family in making decisions about whether an individual is a danger to themselves or others and what options there are for that, such as inpatient treatment in a mental health hospital, going to the local emergency room to get to that point, to where they can be admitted into an inpatient mental health treatment facility. There's often frustration that I find working in the field with Department of Child Safety. There are normally teenagers being the most adamant population that threaten suicide or attempt suicide. Parents call the crisis team, and depending on the state of the child at the time that the team responds, that determines what the crisis team is able to do or help the family with. So there is frustration involved with this for the families and the social workers, as there has to be certain criteria met for someone to be in inpatient mental health treatment. Although they might not always get that option, they are available and able to provide resources for the families for future mental health treatment, whether that involves inpatient or not. Social workers working with families in inpatient mental health treatment work with families who are in a state of crisis. Family members, individuals don't normally come into inpatient health treatment unless they were in a state of major crisis, whether they wanted to harm themselves, others, or whether they did attempt to harm themselves or commit suicide. There's a plan put in place inpatient to stabilize the client, whether that be through medications, through group therapies, individual therapies, meeting with social workers to plan their next steps when they get released. A plan must be made with the client and parties involved. So, let's say myself working with the Department of Child Safety, if that patient is a mom who has children at home, they would involve myself in that plan to make sure that mom would not be in an unsafe situation going back home. Family members, such as if that mom had a husband who lived in the home, if they lived with their parents or other relatives, they would involve them in that treatment plan to ensure that the client has the best ability for success upon leaving. Um, Usually, the plan involves some sort of outpatient treatment plan to work with a therapist at least once a week, sometimes more than once a week. Go to support groups. If there's addiction involved, then those services will be looked at as well. So there's an overall view of, hey, we ended up in this situation. What do we do to prevent this from occurring again? What plan can we make with you and your family to ensure that you have the best and most healthy reunification with your family, or just integrating back into the population once your time in the mental health facility is complete. Outpatient mental health treatment can look different for each individual or family dynamic, whether that's couples counseling, family counseling, individual counseling. Case managers who are social workers can work alongside clinicians, or social workers could get licensed as a master's level social worker and conduct individual and family sessions as well as group sessions for individuals who are experiencing, let's say, the loss of loved ones in grief therapy, so that there's a support group there for them. Outpatient mental health treatment is very valuable. It teaches the coping skills to deal with daily life stressors, along with trauma that someone may have endured in their past or trauma that's occurring now. Social workers that work alongside with clinicians in mental health settings can be valuable in helping clients set up these plans um, and work with their families to help them have the best scenario for success possible. Mental health treatment is important not only for the individual in therapy or the group, but for their families and their environments as well, so that the client has the best chances of succeeding in their life goals and meeting the goals set for themselves in treatment with the clinician or social worker. Outpatient mental health treatment provides clients with the empowerment to look forward and make not only the goals for themselves, but inspire to greater things. Outpatient mental health treatment can be very valuable after a crisis has occurred, as the response made by initial social workers in a hospital setting, a mental health treatment setting that's inpatient, hospice, they're there initially, but when the client's released, they need that support in their everyday lives. So, an ongoing team to assist them in coping with this new life that may have changed after crisis occurred.
Crisis is an international phenomenon affecting all cultures and all people. Anyone, anytime can be subject to a crisis, and at some point in their lives most likely will be. The crisis can be natural, such as a tsunami, an earthquake, tornadoes, or hurricanes, or it can be of unnatural causes such as war. In the middle of a crisis, basic needs must be met, such as water, food, housing, and in addition to that, support with grieving for their loss of their house or their possessions, and for loss of their family and friends. An example of crisis intervention being used in an international situation was the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. As a result of that tsunami, there were many child survivors that couldn't find their families, and crisis intervention was utilized in a non deliberate way to help these children survive the crisis they had been through. They utilized guided artwork where they had the children draw out how they were feeling to help them adjust to the loss that they had just witnessed. Another example of crisis intervention being used with a diverse client system would be in China in May of 2008. There was a massive earthquake. The social workers in China were not equipped for how to handle this situation. They partnered with Widener University in Chester, Pennsylvania, and a training session was developed that took 2 weeks. And they trained the social workers in China to be able to serve the population with this crisis intervention due to the severity of the earthquake.
On this slide, we're going to be talking about the strengths of crisis theory. Now, during the crisis situation, a lot can be going on with the client and the family. So, a strength of it could be, providing a concrete way for the client to identify what the crisis is, um, and what specifically is going on, so they can then learn, um, how to manage it. They can learn how coping mechanisms, that will help them, you know, handle the situation afterwards. Once, you know, the assessment and then, you know, is done, it helps them gain control of the situation, and it's a fast approach. It's a fast approach to, you know, helping them find a way to learn coping mechanisms that they can deal with at different times. You know, there might be a different life stage that they might be at. It might be a tragic situation that has occurred, or a problem that has built up to a crisis. They then learn how to manage it. It helps meet the emotional needs of the client. So the worker, provider, clinician is able to validate, provide empathy, utilize reflective listening, in some ways motivational learning, but in a very quick manner that allows the client to vent, and then they then are able to you know, gain coping mechanisms, healthy coping mechanisms to manage the situation afterwards. You know, and many people don't realize that after the assessment is done, after, you know, the crisis is identified, that's when the client and the family need to then learn how to have you know, a safety plan in place so they can build on what they had learned with the clinician during the assessment. And it provides the clinician, provider, worker a way of you know, it gives them the necessary tools to respond in an effective manner. Yeah, it's a very systematic approach, but it's a very quick approach, and it's very effective. On this slide, we're going to be talking about the limitations of crisis theory, and it can be very challenging because rapport has to be established quickly. And what we know with clients is, you know, when we first have sessions with them, we need to build rapport with them. We need to get an understanding of what their situation is. We need to be able to hear their story, and many times they are very uncomfortable. They're not sure about what, you know, what the engagement process is, what the assessment process is, and add on to that a crisis situation. Then it then becomes a very quick approach to being able to immediately learn to provide empathy, validation, and it has to be quick, and that's a very difficult situation. In some cases, clients going through a crisis are overwhelmed and they're not able to think clearly, so it becomes very difficult to build rapport and find answers to with the assessment and what's really happening. So it can be very, very difficult to build that rapport, and that's a challenging aspect to crisis theory. Again, there's a limited time for engagement and assessment, so you have very quickly, you have to be able to identify it quickly, and you have to go through it very systematically, but in an efficient manner. But it is very challenging because, again, every situation is different. Some clients might be in a very high, severe risk crisis situation, so the provider, clinician, or worker then has to make the quick clinical judgment in limited time, which is very challenging. You know, law enforcement might need to be called. In some cases, the client may need to be de-escalated, so the assessment can't be done right away. So it's a very challenging approach. So the clinician then has to adapt to the situation. They may have a plan in place, but they have to adapt to the specific situation. And again, every client is different. The situation can escalate quickly if, you know, in every situation. So in some cases, if the clinician, provider, or worker has limited knowledge on crisis interventions, it can be very challenging to provide engagement, provide support when they may be overthinking the situation. So it has to be, so knowledge in crisis theory is very important. So they can, you know, have it come very naturally, but very efficiently, and it can be a very difficult situation. So there are a lot of limitations with the quickness of the process, but as a clinician, as a provider, as a worker, you learn to adapt to these situations, and it becomes much more comforting the more you do it. Crisis situations are very challenging in many ways, and every situation is different, but it can be time limited and challenging with the with the crisis situation.